I was a janitor fired for theft until I exposed the manager's drug ring. But that morning, staring at the pink slip in my calloused hands, I had no idea the hell I was about to unleash on the bastards who destroyed my life. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in Peterson Manufacturing's break room, casting that sickly yellow glow that made everyone look like corpses. My supervisor, Marcus Webb, sat across from me with his arms folded, his thin lips pressed into what he probably thought was an authoritative line. Behind him stood Janet from HR, clutching a manila folder like it contained nuclear codes. Webb's eyes never met mine as he slid the termination papers across the scratched Formica table. The papers made a whisper soft sound against the surface, a sound I'd remember for the rest of my life. 23 years I'd mopped these floors, emptied these trash cans, kept this place running while the suits above collected their bonuses and forgot my name. The accusation hit like a physical blow: theft of company property, specifically a laptop computer from the executive wing worth $3,000. Security footage, they claimed, showed me entering the office after hours. My keycard logs confirmed it. Case closed. I picked up the papers, feeling their weight, heavier than they should have been for something so thin. My hands didn't shake. They should have, but they didn't. Instead, a cold clarity settled over me like ice water in my veins. Webb's fingers drummed against the table in an impatient rhythm. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. The same rhythm I'd noticed during our monthly safety meetings, when he thought nobody was watching. The same rhythm he tapped when Brian Kozlowski from maintenance asked too many questions about the locked storage room in the basement. Janet cleared her throat, a sharp sound that cut through the humming lights. She opened the folder and began reading from what I assumed was some corporate script about final paychecks and surrendering company property. Her voice faded into background noise as I studied Webb's face, cataloging every micro-expression, every tell I'd somehow missed during 2 decades of taking his orders. The security badge clipped to his shirt pocket caught the light. Level 4 clearance, higher than mine, but not high enough for the executive wing where the laptop supposedly went missing. Yet here he was, handling my termination personally instead of letting HR do their job. I signed the papers where they indicated, my signature looking strange and foreign under the harsh lights. Webb collected them quickly, too quickly, like he couldn't wait to get me out of his sight. Janet mumbled something about escorting me to collect my personal belongings. My locker held the accumulated debris of 23 years. Family photos, extra work gloves, a thermos my wife Sarah had bought me for Christmas 15 years ago. Janet stood behind me, watching as I stuffed everything into a cardboard box that barely contained the fragments of my working life. The walk to the parking lot felt endless. Each step echoed in the empty hallway, bouncing off walls I'd cleaned thousands of times. Janet handed me back my employee ID badge at the security desk, a final humiliation, as if I might try to sneak back in and steal more fictional laptops. Outside, the October air bit at my face. My truck sat in the far corner of the parking lot, right where I'd parked it every morning at 5:47 a.m. for the past 8 years. The same spot, the same routine, the same thankless work that apparently meant nothing to these people. I sat in the driver's seat for 10 minutes, staring at the building that had defined my adult life. The windows reflected nothing but gray sky and darker clouds rolling in from the west. Rain was coming. The drive home passed in a blur of traffic lights and half-formed thoughts. Sarah would be at her sister's for another week, helping with the new baby. She didn't need to know about this yet, not until I figured out what came next. The house felt hollow without her, every room echoing with the weight of sudden unemployment and manufactured shame. I set the card box on the kitchen table and stared at it. 23 years reduced to objects that barely filled a shoebox. The injustice of it burned in my chest, not hot like anger, but cold like hypothermia, numbing and deadly. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the meeting, analyzing every word Webb hadn't said, every glance he'd avoided. The laptop theft made no sense. I'd never stolen so much as a paperclip in my entire career. My record was spotless, my reviews consistently satisfactory. Why now? Why me? At 3 a.m., I found myself standing in my garage, staring at the wall where I'd hung Sarah's father's old corkboard. During his 40 years as a city detective, he'd used it to map cases. Red string connecting photographs, documents, witness statements, a spider web of evidence that led to truth. I cleared the board and pinned my termination papers in the center. Around them, I began arranging everything I could remember about the weeks leading up to my firing. Webb's nervous habits, the locked storage room, the way certain employees avoided eye contact when they passed me in the halls. 3 days later, I drove back to Peterson Manufacturing. Not to make a scene or beg for my job back, but to observe. I parked across the street at a gas station and watched the morning shift change through binoculars Sarah had bought for birdwatching. Webb arrived at 8:15 in his silver BMW, the same car he'd somehow afforded on a supervisor's salary. He parked in a reserved spot near the executive entrance. Curious, since his office was on the ground floor with the rest of middle management. I watched him walk to the building, noting the slight limp in his left leg that I'd never noticed before. He favored that side when he thought nobody was looking. The kind of compensation pattern you develop after an old injury, or after carrying heavy boxes. That afternoon, I called my nephew Danny, who worked in IT for a security company downtown. Over coffee at a diner 20 miles from Peterson Manufacturing, I explained my situation in careful terms. Danny listened without judgment, occasionally nodding as I laid out the timeline. He agreed to help, not for money, but because family meant something to him. Within a week, he'd provided me with software that could recover deleted files from hard drives and a small digital camera designed for surveillance work. Nothing illegal, he assured me, just tools to level the playing field. The first break came from an unexpected source. Trash day. Peterson Manufacturing contracted with Municipal Waste Services, the same company that handled residential pickup in my neighborhood. Their trucks followed predictable routes, emptying dumpsters behind the plant every Tuesday and Friday at 6 a.m. sharp. I started following the truck on my bicycle, staying far enough back to avoid suspicion. The driver, a middle-aged guy named Tom who recognized me from the neighborhood, didn't question why I was out for early morning rides. People mind their own business when you don't give them a reason not to. On the third Friday, I struck gold. Tom's route included a brief stop at a gas station to use the restroom. While he was inside, I quickly rifled through the bags from Peterson Manufacturing's executive wing, looking for anything Webb might have been careless enough to throw away. Most of it was standard office waste. Coffee cups, meeting notes, expired food from the break room refrigerator. But at the bottom of one bag, I found a crumpled envelope addressed to Webb at his home address. The return address made my blood run cold. Sunshine Pharmaceuticals with a Miami postmark. I pocketed the envelope and was back on my bicycle before Tom returned. At home, I smoothed out the paper and studied it under a magnifying glass. The envelope was empty, but the postmark was dated 3 days before my termination. The company name meant nothing to me then, but I filed it away with the growing collection of evidence on my father-in-law's corkboard. The second break came from paying attention to patterns. Every Tuesday and Thursday, Webb left the building at exactly 11:47 a.m. Not 11:45, not noon, 11:47. He'd walk to his BMW, drive away for exactly 1 hour and 13 minutes, then return looking slightly more relaxed than when he'd left. I followed him on the third Thursday, keeping several cars between us as he drove through downtown traffic. He parked behind a strip mall on the east side, in a lot that served a dry cleaner, a sandwich shop, and a small medical supply store called MedTech Solutions. Webb didn't go to any of those businesses. Instead, he walked around to the back of the building, where a loading dock served all 3 storefronts. A white panel van was parked there, its rear doors open. 2 men in coveralls were transferring boxes from the van to a hand truck. I parked where I could observe without being seen and took photographs with the surveillance camera Danny had given me. The license plate on the van was registered to a company called Coastal Logistics, another name for my growing files. Webb spent exactly 17 minutes at the loading dock, shaking hands with both men before they closed the van and drove away. He returned to his BMW carrying nothing visible, but there was something different about his posture. Looser, more confident, like a man who just completed successful business. Over the next 2 weeks, I documented this pattern. Always Tuesday and Thursday. Always 11:47 to 1 o'clock. Always the same loading dock, though the faces sometimes change. The white van remained constant, as did Webb's ritual 17-minute meetings. The third break came from old-fashioned detective work. I spent hours at the public library, using their computers to research every name and company I'd collected. Sunshine Pharmaceuticals had been investigated by the DEA 3 years ago for suspicious ordering patterns of controlled substances. The investigation had ended without charges, but the company's federal licensing had been suspended twice for paperwork irregularities. MedTech Solutions was registered as a wholesale medical supply distributor, but their state license showed numerous violations for incomplete record-keeping. Coastal Logistics had been cited by the Department of Transportation for operating vehicles without proper manifests. None of these violations were serious enough to shut down the businesses, but together they painted a picture of an ecosystem designed to move products without creating paper trails. I needed more than circumstantial evidence. The opportunity came on a rainy Thursday in November. Sarah was still helping her sister, giving me freedom to take risks I wouldn't have considered with her safety to worry about. I called in sick to the temp job I'd taken at a warehouse across town, then positioned myself near Peterson Manufacturing before dawn. Webb's routine never varied, but that morning the white van arrived early. Instead of waiting in the loading dock, it parked directly behind the main building, near the employee entrance I'd used for 23 years. Through my binoculars, I watched two men in coveralls use what looked like Webb's key card to enter the building. They emerged 20 minutes later carrying a large rolling suitcase, the kind executives use for business trips. The suitcase went into the van. Webb appeared just as they were closing the rear doors, and I saw him hand over something small enough to fit in his palm. Money, most likely, though I couldn't be certain from my distance. But I didn't need to be certain about the money. I needed to be certain about what was in that suitcase. That evening, I drove to the Peterson Manufacturing parking lot after the day shift had ended. Security was minimal. Just a few cameras and a part-time guard who spent most of his time reading magazines in the front lobby. I knew the building's blind spots better than anyone. 23 years of emptying trash cans in every corner, cleaning windows from every angle, mopping floors in every room. The loading dock had a service door that connected to the basement storage area, and that door's lock had been broken for at least 6 months. I slipped inside just after midnight, using a small flashlight to navigate corridors I could have walked blindfolded. The basement storage room that Webb kept locked was exactly where I remembered it, but now I had a better idea of what might be inside. The lock was commercial grade, too sophisticated for my limited breaking and entering skills. But the wall next to it was just drywall, and the room on the other side was the janitor's supply closet, my old domain. I removed enough drywall screws to create a gap large enough to squeeze through, working slowly to minimize noise. The supply closet was exactly as I'd left it 3 weeks ago, down to the same mop bucket sitting in the corner. The storage room beyond was nothing like what I'd expected. Instead of surplus office supplies or old equipment, the space had been converted into a sophisticated packaging and distribution center. Metal shelving lined 3 walls holding hundreds of small boxes marked with medical supply codes. A postal scale sat on a folding table next to stacks of padded envelopes pre-addressed to locations across the state. But it was the open box on the table that made everything clear. Inside were dozens of small bottles, each containing what looked like prescription pills. The labels were professionally printed with medical terminology I didn't recognize, but the DEA schedule numbers were clear enough. Schedule 2 controlled substances, opioids. I photographed everything, using the camera's flash sparingly to avoid detection. The bottles, the shipping labels, the return addresses that led back to a network of seemingly legitimate medical supply companies. In one corner, I found shipping manifests that detailed the monthly volume. Thousands of pills moving through Peterson Manufacturing's basement every week. Webb wasn't just stealing from the company. He was using it as a distribution hub for a prescription drug trafficking operation that stretched across 3 states. The laptop theft that had cost me my job was probably a cover story, designed to explain increased security measures, or to remove someone who might have started asking uncomfortable questions. I'd been collateral damage in a criminal enterprise that was using my former workplace as its base of operations. I was photographing the last shelf when I heard footsteps upstairs. The security guard was making his rounds, probably just checking doors and windows before settling back into his magazine. But his footsteps were moving toward the stairwell that led to the basement, and I had no way to get back through the hole in the wall without making noise. I turned off the flashlight and crouched behind the metal shelving, listening to the guard's progress overhead. His footsteps paused at the top of the stairs, and I heard the jingle of keys as he checked the basement door. The lock turned. Light spilled down the stairwell as the door opened. I pressed myself deeper into the shadows, trying to control my breathing as the guard's flashlight beam swept across the basement. He was being thorough tonight, checking corners and doorways he usually ignored. The beam passed over the storage room door, lingering on the lock for several seconds. If he decided to check inside, I was finished. Not just caught trespassing, but caught with evidence of Webb's operation. Evidence that would disappear long before any investigation could begin. The guard's radio crackled with static. A voice I couldn't make out said something brief, and the guard responded with a quick acknowledgement. His footsteps moved away from the storage room, back toward the stairs. I waited until I heard the basement door close and lock before moving. Getting back through the hole in the wall took twice as long as entering, but I managed it without disturbing anything that would suggest my presence. By 2 a.m., I was back home, uploading photographs to Danny's secure server, and updating the evidence board in my garage. The picture was complete now, or complete enough to destroy Webb and everyone connected to him. But I wanted more than just Webb's destruction. I wanted justice for 23 years of honest work, for the reputation they'd tried to destroy. For every morning I'd arrived early, and every evening I'd stayed late to make sure their building was clean and secure. I wanted them to know exactly who had brought them down and why. The plan took shape over the next week, each detail calculated for maximum impact and minimum risk to myself. It wasn't enough to simply turn over evidence to the police. Law enforcement investigations moved slowly, and smart criminals had time to destroy evidence and disappear. I needed to create a situation where Webb and his partners would be caught in the act, with no opportunity to cover their tracks or claim ignorance. The key was timing. I documented their regular Tuesday and Thursday pickups, but I needed to know about their bigger operations. Criminals got comfortable with routine, but they also needed to move larger quantities to make real money. I spent another week following the white van after it left Peterson Manufacturing. It made stops at 7 different locations across the city, always following the same route, always making the same carefully timed deliveries. The pattern suggested they were supplying a network of street-level dealers, probably people who thought they were buying legitimate pharmaceutical overstock. The volume I'd seen in the storage room was too large for local distribution. This was wholesale trafficking designed to feed addiction across multiple states. On the Friday before Thanksgiving, everything changed. Instead of the usual white van, a large box truck arrived at Peterson Manufacturing's loading dock. The same 2 men in coveralls were there, but this time they were loading the truck instead of unloading it. Box after box came out of the building, enough product to supply their entire regional network for months. I photographed the truck's license plate and followed it to a warehouse complex near the interstate. The facility was large enough to handle serious distribution, with loading docks for multiple vehicles and office space for coordinating logistics. This was their main distribution hub, and the Peterson Manufacturing basement was just one of several collection points feeding into a much larger operation. But it also presented the perfect opportunity for my revenge. I spent the weekend preparing. Danny helped me understand the technical aspects of the surveillance equipment I'd need, while I used my intimate knowledge of Peterson Manufacturing to plan exactly how to document everything in a way that would be impossible to explain away. The security guard's schedule was predictable, and I knew which cameras covered which angles. More importantly, I knew that Webb's operation depended on the assumption that nobody was paying attention to the basement storage room. 23 years of being invisible had taught me how to stay that way when it mattered. Tuesday morning, I positioned myself across the street 2 hours before Webb's usual meeting time. I'd modified the surveillance camera with a telephoto lens, giving me clear shots of both the loading dock and the basement windows. At 11:47 exactly, Webb left the building and drove to his usual rendezvous. But instead of following him, I waited for the white van to arrive at Peterson Manufacturing. The 2 men in coveralls used Webb's key card to enter through the employee entrance. I photographed them loading boxes from the basement into their van, capturing clear images of their faces and the medical supply labels on the containers. When they finished loading, one of them made a phone call. Within minutes, the box truck I'd followed on Friday arrived at the loading dock. This was the consolidation I'd been waiting for. The moment when everything came together in one location, with multiple witnesses and no plausible explanation except the truth. I photographed the transfer from van to truck, the handshake between drivers, the stack of cash that changed hands. But I needed more than photographs. I needed audio, video, and documentary evidence that would survive in court. That night, I returned to the basement storage room. This time I came prepared with additional equipment Danny had reluctantly agreed to provide: a digital voice recorder small enough to hide behind one of the storage shelves, and a tiny wireless camera that could transmit video to a receiver I'd hidden in my truck. Installing the devices took less than an hour, and I was back home before the security guard made his midnight rounds. The next day, I tested the signal strength and confirmed that both devices were functioning properly. Now I just had to wait for Webb to schedule another big shipment. The opportunity came sooner than expected. On Wednesday, I intercepted another discarded envelope from Webb's trash. This one contained a handwritten note with dates, quantities, and what looked like delivery instructions. The largest quantity was scheduled for Thursday night, tomorrow, with pickup instructions that suggested this would be their biggest transfer yet. I spent Wednesday night positioning additional cameras around the building perimeter, creating multiple angles that would capture every aspect of the operation. Danny had insisted on encrypted storage for all the video files, ensuring that even if I were caught, the evidence would survive. Thursday evening, I was in position before sunset. Webb stayed late, which was unusual, but made sense if he was coordinating a major shipment. The building emptied of legitimate employees by 6 p.m., leaving only Webb and the security guard. At 8:30, the white van arrived. At 8:45, the box truck pulled up to the loading dock. At 9 o'clock, a third vehicle appeared, a black SUV with tinted windows that parked near the employee entrance. I'd never seen the SUV before, which meant tonight's operation was bigger than anything I documented. Bigger meant more people, more money, and more evidence. The basement storage room's hidden camera captured everything. Webb supervised the loading personally, checking items against a list he kept on a clipboard. The two men in coveralls moved efficiently, but they were clearly nervous about something. The SUV's occupants, two men in expensive suits, stood nearby watching every box that came out of storage. One of the suited men had a briefcase handcuffed to his wrist. When the loading was complete, he opened it to reveal stacks of cash arranged in neat bundles. Webb counted the money carefully before nodding his approval. The entire transaction took 47 minutes. I had it all on video, with clear audio of Webb giving instructions about delivery schedules and payment terms. There was no way to interpret this as anything other than large-scale drug trafficking. But I still wasn't finished. As the vehicles prepared to leave, I activated the final phase of my plan. Using a prepaid cell phone, I called the county sheriff's department and reported suspicious activity at Peterson Manufacturing. I described the vehicles, the loading dock activity, and suggested they might want to check for controlled substances. Then I called the State Police Drug Task Force and reported the same information. Then I called the DEA tip line and provided license plate numbers for all three vehicles. The first patrol car arrived 18 minutes later, just as the convoy was preparing to leave the Peterson Manufacturing parking lot. The box truck was already pulling away when the police lights appeared, but the white van and black SUV were still on company property. I watched through binoculars as the traffic stop turned into a full investigation. More patrol cars arrived, followed by detectives and what looked like federal agents. Webb tried to remain calm, but I could see his composure cracking as officers began asking questions about the vehicles and their contents. The search of the van revealed exactly what I'd hoped: dozens of bottles of controlled substances with no legitimate medical documentation. The SUV contained cash, records, and what appeared to be distribution lists for multiple states. Webb's arrest happened in full view of the Peterson Manufacturing security cameras, ensuring that his employers would have no doubt about what their facility had been used for. But my revenge wasn't complete until the following Monday. I'd spent the weekend preparing a comprehensive package for Peterson Manufacturing's board of directors, the local newspaper, the state licensing board, and every federal agency with jurisdiction over pharmaceutical trafficking. The package included printed photographs, video files, audio recordings, and a detailed timeline showing how Webb had used company facilities to operate his distribution network. I documented everything from the modified storage room to the shipping schedules, creating an unassailable case that no corporate legal team could explain away. More importantly, I'd included evidence of the laptop theft that had cost me my job, Webb's own security footage I downloaded before it could be deleted, showed him entering the executive wing after hours on the night the laptop disappeared. The same laptop that turned up in his personal vehicle when police searched it during his arrest. He'd stolen company property to create a pretext for increasing security measures around his drug operation. My termination had been cover for his crimes, a way to remove a potential witness who had too much access to the basement storage area. The local newspaper ran the story on Tuesday morning, complete with photographs and excerpts from the police reports. Peterson Manufacturing stock price dropped 12% before trading was suspended. The FBI announced they were expanding their investigation to include potential company-wide corruption. Webb was arraigned on 17 felony counts, including trafficking and controlled substances, money laundering, theft of company property, and conspiracy. His bail was set at $500,000, money he suddenly couldn't afford now that his assets were frozen pending investigation. But the most satisfying moment came on Wednesday afternoon. I was in my garage finally dismantling the evidence board that had consumed my life for the past 2 months when my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw Janet from HR standing on my front porch, holding the same manila folder she'd carried to my termination meeting. She looked smaller somehow, less sure of herself. Her usual corporate composure had been replaced by something that looked like embarrassment mixed with fear. I opened the door but didn't invite her inside. She explained that Peterson Manufacturing had conducted an internal investigation following Webb's arrest. They discovered evidence that my termination had been based on fabricated charges, and they wanted to offer me reinstatement with full back pay and benefits. The company was also prepared to discuss additional compensation for the damage to my reputation and the emotional distress I'd suffered as a result of their employees' criminal actions. I let her finish her entire presentation, watching her squirm as she tried to make corporate speak sound like a genuine apology. When she was done, I smiled for the first time in 2 months. I told her I'd have my attorney review their offer and get back to them. I didn't mention that I'd already accepted a position with the county sheriff's department, working as a civilian investigator specializing in white-collar crime. My experience with Webb's case had impressed the detective who'd handled the investigation, and they'd offered me a job that paid 30% more than Peterson Manufacturing ever had. I also didn't mention that 3 other former Peterson Manufacturing employees had contacted me about suspicious activities they'd observed but been afraid to report. Webb's operation was apparently just the beginning of the problems that company was about to face. Janet left the folder on my porch table and walked back to her car without another word. I watched her drive away, then opened the folder to review their settlement offer. It was generous. More money than I'd expected, plus a formal letter of apology that admitted the company's mistake and cleared my employment record of any wrongdoing. But what I appreciated most was the handwritten note paper clipped to the offer letter. The new plant manager, Webb's replacement, had written a personal message acknowledging that my termination had been unjust and thanking me for bringing the truth to light. He promised that Peterson Manufacturing would implement new security measures to ensure nothing like this could happen again. It was signed with genuine regret and what seemed like honest remorse. That evening, I called Sarah to tell her she could come home. Her sister's baby was doing well, and it was time for us to start the next chapter of our lives. I'd spent 2 months learning that revenge, done properly, wasn't about anger or hatred. It was about patience, preparation, and the cold satisfaction of watching justice finally catch up with people who thought they were untouchable. Webb would spend the next decade in federal prison, his drug trafficking network dismantled, his co-conspirators facing their own reckoning with the law. Peterson Manufacturing would survive, but with new leadership and new policies designed to prevent their facilities from being used for criminal enterprises. And I would start my new job on Monday, helping other victims of white-collar crime find the evidence they needed to expose the truth. 23 years of invisible work had taught me how to see things other people missed. Now I was finally ready to use that skill for something more meaningful than mopping floors and emptying trash cans. Justice, I'd learned, was a lot like janitorial work. Both required attention to detail, persistence in the face of obstacles, and the patience to clean up messes that other people preferred to ignore. The only difference was that this time, I was cleaning up messes that deserved to be exposed to the light.